Brighter goals, engaging experiences, and better signals. That's the Carnegie Foundation ETS Skills for the Future framework. We're talking about that today on the Getting Smart podcast. I'm Tom Vander Ark, and joined today by Laura Slover, the Managing Director of Skills for the Future at ETS. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Tom. Nice to be here.
We are joined by Mike Flanagan from the Mastery Transcript Consortium. Now 5 months into being part of ETS. Is that right, Mike?
That's exactly right. Yeah, we're part of the ETS family of companies. Nice to see you, Tom.
Great to see you guys. You're fresh from Aurora, where I think you both presented. Is that right?
Yes, we did.
I did not. We actually turned a nice milestone where we had multiple schools talking about how they're using MTC's records. So I didn't have to, but I had some colleagues talk about higher ed uptake, which I'm sure we'll cover later in the conversation.
I should mention that I'm still a board member of the Mastery Transcript Consortium. And so I noticed that there was a lot of social media of schools talking about their Mastery Transcript in the last week. You guys had a good showing there. Laura, I've been thinking about our intersections 25 years ago, really at the beginning, early days of the standards movement. Laura, you've really been a key architect of the education system. I was mentioning to Mike as we were just getting on that Achieve was really a remarkable organization. People may forget the key political role that Achieve played, because your board was governors and CEOs.
Right.
It really owned at a high level the American education agenda. Is that a bit of an overstatement, or is that fair?
No, I don't think it's an overstatement at all. When Achieve was launched, it was launched at the National Governors Association Summit, the National Governors Summit in 1997, when governors and CEOs came together and scratched their head about what they could do to start the next generation of school reform and make sure that we were preparing all kids for success. And out of that work came the American Diploma Project. It came a real emphasis on state leadership and trying to make sure that state constituents, both the K-12 sector and higher ed and business, were working together to put kids on a path to success.
It was a time of really remarkable bipartisan support. You had Republican governors and Democrat governors, and on the Hill, we had a remarkable bipartisan support for higher expectations for all students, better measures, and an accountability system that made sure that every family in America had access to good schools. It was an agenda that really, people forget, I think it had really broad support, political support and business support, and Achieve was really a critical player orchestrating that support. So I appreciate the role that you played there with Mike Cohen. Reflections on leading at Achieve and then Park. What's your takeaway from those 20 plus years, Laura?
You're making me feel old, but we're really just at a new nexus, a beginning point. So I'd say that Achieve with governors and CEOs really set the stage for the college and career readiness for all agenda, and making sure that all students, regardless of their background, their zip code, their parents' income, were going to have a fair shot at a quality education that would open doors to what came next: post-secondary education, good jobs that could pay a living wage. And I think the drumbeat of that, although things have changed and morphed over the last 20 to 25 years, remains. And I think that work was instrumental in getting us to where we are now. Now, the world has changed, technology has changed, the way we think about schools have changed, and oh yes, we had a pandemic, and it's been hard to regain traction since then. But I think the elements of education that prepares students for work and for college and does it in equitable ways to provide access for all is still at the core of what we care about in doing our work now at Skills for the Future and just as Americans.
I have a wonky question, Laura. I remember in 2000, as No Child Left Behind was coming together, there were a lot of us that were advocating for growth and proficiency, that we wanted to be able to measure both growth and proficiency. And we just couldn't come up with very good ways to measure growth at the time. And as a result, the big bargain became around grade level proficiency. And that's what we've been measuring for the last 20 years. And it came at some expense to not having a bargain around growth. Is that an accurate memory?
Certainly at the outset, I think there was much more focus on output and not growth. And that changed over the years. But many states differ on how they were going to measure growth, how they were going to track growth. There were different, I don't think we've ever reached a national consensus on what constitutes growth and how to measure it precisely. But I do know in the last decade, as opposed to the early decade, there's been more emphasis on growth.
Mike, it's interesting to note that as No Child Left Behind was coming together, there was also a progressive schools movement where there are hundreds of really great public and private schools being formed, some of them in networks. And one of the outgrowths of that was the Hawken School in Cleveland and a lot of schools like that, and the beginning of the Mastery Transcript Consortium by a progressive school leader, Scott Looney, that felt the constraints of courses and grades and wanted a new signaling system. And somehow you, after a career you started in education and then technology, and how did you intersect with Scott at the origin of the Mastery Transcript Consortium?
Yeah, so Scott, the founder of MTC and still the head of the school at Hawken, and both the Hawken School and the Mastery School of Hawken, was on my board for a technology organization that I was leading in my last job. We were a technology group within a nonprofit association, and we replatformed the product. And then it meant our association had the happy problem of having too much surplus revenue, which is for those of you out there who are in the for-profit world, that's the 501c3 euphemism for profit. That technology got bought by a private equity company right around the time that Scott was started the initiative. But really, as you said, years ago, I was a classroom teacher. The first actually tech job I had was in what was then the kind of the corporate learning and like web-based training space. And so I actually was doing competency models and working with clients doing backwards design processes to figure out what the essential skills were for a particular role, like long before kind of we were doing any of this. And so it's kind of interesting to see it all come full circle again.
And is it fair to say that Looney and the group that he organized around was really looking for a new way to signal student success? What was the original goal?
I think there was a general consensus, as you said, no shortage of lab schools or charters or school within a school, no shortage of alternative learner-centered models. Folks experimented with different ways of doing high school that was more relevant, useful, and engaging. More project-based, experiential, breaking like down the wall between inside and outside of classroom learning. The problem is none of that rich learning was showing up anywhere on the traditional credentials that we think of as high school, right? When you and I first met, Tom, I was talking about there is value in a traditional transcript, right? It is useful to be able to package and essentially containerize high school in the form of Carnegie units and academic subjects and grades. The problem is that system of measurement has become so baked into all of our systems, both including the policy, accountability, even the funding level, that it really becomes hard to do school in different ways. So that was it. This tension between an appetite to do school in new and better ways and the metrics that we were being forced to use. And so the idea was a very simple one, which is what if you just created an alternative credentialing system that all of these schools could embrace, and then through collective action, make it legible, acceptable, and hopefully valued by higher education and workforce.
So it's interesting that aspiration is, I think, a big part of what has brought you two together. Laura, I reflected on how you were an important architect of the last 30 years, and now with the Skills for the Future team, including Mastery Transcript, you're a key architect for what I think will be the framework for the next 30 years. You guys call that Skills for the Future. How do you think about that initiative? What is it? How is Carnegie Foundation involved in it? And why is it important, a new priority for ETS?
Mike and I are now happily together on this path to look forward to the next 30 years. And I want to say a little bit about the Skills for the Future effort, which is a partnership initially between Carnegie and ETS. Amit Suvag from ETS and Tim Knowles from Carnegie got together and acknowledged that the Carnegie unit, which was first brought to the world by the Carnegie Foundation, and then ETS and standardized testing, which was founded actually by Carnegie about 75 years ago, that they made a lot of impact on the education space. And yet some of that impact was, again, holding back innovation and new thinking. And so together, the two said, hey, let's rethink education. Let's change the architecture. Carnegie has gone deep on trying to help revolutionize and undo the Carnegie unit, which conflates time and learning, and really to say, let's have competency-based education that allows students to really focus on outcomes and not sit in their chair. And also acknowledges that learning happens everywhere. Kids are in school 180 days a year, 6 hours a day, which includes lunch. So they're only getting a certain amount of learning within the classroom. And let's acknowledge that they're also learning a lot outside of school through activities, jobs, apprenticeships, but that's largely invisible to us. We don't have ways to capture that. And when students then sit and take assessments, people think about the large scale end of year state assessments. The data come back late. They're not aligned really to what students are doing in their classrooms. And so there's been a deep disconnect and growing frustration with both a system that locks kids in classrooms and a system in which assessments are not really capturing the skills and abilities that kids have.
So I want to underscore the delicious irony that Tim Knowles is leading the Carnegie Foundation, which is responsible for creating the Carnegie unit, which Mike has created MTC to get rid of, to not at least not be trapped in the container of courses and grades and be able to give kids the ability to more fully express their capabilities. I want to acknowledge that Carnegie was in part inspired by some work that XQ has done in the last 10 years in high school reform. And so XQ inspired a partnership with Carnegie. Carnegie
Yes.
inspired a partnership with ETS. And earlier I described it as broader goals, a broader set of goals than just a focus on reading, writing, and math. Doesn't exclude those, but it's also a broader expression of work-ready, durable skills. Number two, powerful experiences, engaging experiences that bring that to life. And then number three, better signals. And so it sounds like ETS has an outcome framework, a meta framework that builds on a lot of the new outcome frameworks that were developed over the last 10 years. Is that how you think about it? And are you trying to build assessments now against that new framework?
Yes and yes. So initially, ETS and Carnegie came together in the spring of 2023 and made an announcement that the two organizations were going to work together to change the education architecture. And the first phase of that was to do a deep dive on the research, knowing that they wanted to broaden the aperture of what students were learning and really focus on a broader set of skills. They first did research, and I'm saying they because this predates me. They did research on what are the skills that are most predictive of success in a number of important outcomes: high school graduation, college completion, work readiness, and then some community and well-being gains. To do that, they looked at economic research, but they also looked at what are states doing and what are international frameworks. They looked at portraits of a graduate, which now I think nearly half the states have put in place. And portraits, as you all know, redefine the what of what do we want a student to know and be able to do. And although many states have taken steps to create them, they're largely aspirational still because they're not really being enacted. Back to my story, ETS and Carnegie did a study looking at those, looking at things like the XQ frameworks and the America Succeeds competencies, and looking at international skills frameworks. And from those and the data that looked at which are the most predictive, identified 11 skills, the majority of which appeared in all of those frameworks, things that wouldn't surprise you, like communication, collaboration, curiosity, critical thinking, civic engagement, etc. Those are the things that then the two organizations said, hey, we've got to make sure that those are infused in not just in student learning experiences, but also in our system. If we don't measure those things, and so we've got to start signaling that those things, in fact, are important. The other thing I'd say is that we're not doing this in a vacuum, and that's really important. We're not sitting in the ivory towers of these really highly competent and longstanding institutions. We're actually getting on the ground and working with states. We've got 5 state partners: Indiana, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Wisconsin, and Nevada, who are working in their own states and in their own ways to flesh out their portraits of a graduate, and then collaborating as a group to think about ways of measuring to establish that those skills are, in fact, being learned. Ultimately, we want to show that students can learn those skills and develop those skills wherever they are, in a classroom, outside the classroom. This spring, we'll be piloting some tools in classrooms in those 5 states, and then also supporting the gathering of authentic evidence from classrooms in those states. So we're doing a lot of things, but always doing it in partnership with our state partners.
On the portrait of a graduate, Mike, that's usually the first step for a school that's coming into Mastery Transcript, right? A school or a system, you tell them develop a portrait, develop or adopt a portrait or a profile of a learner. Is that right?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest misconception is that schools arrive to us like looking for transcripts or looking for records, and really what they're doing is they're grappling with the decision they've already made to embrace competencies and put them in the center of their classroom practice and their assessment practices. It just so happens that if you do that, if you actually embed competencies and rich, authentic demonstrations of learning into what you do every day, you then are really well positioned to generate better records, credentials that have better signaling to them. So yeah, the vast majority of schools we work with have or are developing a portrait of a graduate in one form or another.
So Laura, drill down on what's new in assessment. One thing that's different for this initiative compared to the standards movement is we're really focused on reading, writing, and math. And now we're focused not only on reading, writing, and math, but a broader set of job and citizenship ready skills. So broader, but what specifically is going to be different about the assessment system that you're working on with partners? How will it be different than a end of course or end of year standardized assessment?
I'm so glad you asked that, because it's exactly the opposite of that we're trying to build. We're shifting from traditional state assessments to more of what I'd call a suite of tools and authentic experience that capture skills that predict the success in post-secondary education, career, and life that I mentioned, including collaboration, communication, creative, and critical thinking. I didn't mention persistence, but I think that's a really important one too. And as I mentioned, we're aiming to capture evidence of skill development wherever it takes place, whether that's in school or after school activities, sports, internships, etc. There's also an emphasis on family caregiving and jobs, particularly in a couple of our states in which a number of students have family responsibilities before and after school. So there's part of the work that is really about evidence capture and doing that in new and novel ways that are not sit and get, but might be more like a presentation that students video and upload, a performance task that they collaborate on, a competition that they're working on together, or a cool opportunity for a student to partner through AI technology, for example, a chatbot, to solve a problem. The opportunities to use tech and innovation are enormous. I think we're only constrained by what regulations and legislation and rules like FERPA and protecting PII and all of those super important things. I think it's fair to say that kids are doing very sophisticated things in their own non-school lives, and we are going to hope to get as close to those as possible. But I think we know that's going to take some time. The other thing I want to talk about is not just the measures themselves, but the so what. Great, we have all these measures, and what we don't want to do is just provide kids a score report. You're proficient or you're not. What we want to do is think about the capture of learning as more of a learning record or a transcript in which student skills and abilities are always populating. They're always being captured and always populating a record that at any point you could click a button and say, here's where the student is. But it's not just a terminal point, it's through their student experience. And that might include classroom tasks. It should include classroom tasks and out of school tasks. And what we want for that is to serve as an insight system, not just a black hole where stuff goes, but really you put in information and we provide insights. How did you do on that speaking task? What could you do better? Have you leaned in to curiosity, but not as much to leadership? How might you think about that? What we don't want to do is close doors for students or suggest to students that they are not good at something, because we think all students have great potential. So we want to really lean in on to help them identify their assets and give them agency in how to develop them.
I would just say just to build on what Laura just said, it's always been a given that if you have enough data points inside of an organization that you can do analytics, you can use technology for business insights. What I think is interesting is that if we can, and we will, move away from a single moment in time, high stakes assessment to many more data points across many different skill axes for a particular learner, then what you've got is a lot of rich data about an individual. And you can start to generate the kind of personalized recommendations and insights that we always aspire to as educators, right? All of us want to individuate instruction so that all the kids in our care get exactly what they need at the right moment. But it's just so hard, right? It's such a burden. And there's a reason we have educators that are getting burned out and leaving the profession. And so if we can use the advanced technology to reduce that administrative burden, like lower the lift to make it a lot easier for kids to get what they need when they need it from a human being, then I think we're going to be like in exactly the right spot.
As we turn the corner from talking about powerful experiences and better assessments, often embedded in real experiences, let's talk about better signals, how that turns into better information for students, teachers, and other stakeholders. So Laura's team's building these new assessments. How will that information turn into better signals? Maybe you could tell us both about transcripts, a little bit about your mastery tracking system, and learner records. So where does this information go?
Yeah, I can start with the record and then we can work backwards upstream and build on it in case there's anything else that we haven't covered previously talking about the other tools. But, one of the realizations we had when we were building and frankly testing the different records we have with higher ed stakeholders is that we had a blessing and a curse where the first earliest adopters of our records were schools that really had done a lot of work on their own kind of quality side, like making sure that everything they were doing in terms of rich experiences, experiential learning, it was really already baked into the cake, to the point where the schools themselves had a pretty high degree of what you might call like reputational capital or social capital. And that's true whether they're a district school or a charter or an independent school. But it just basically meant that like when a record arrived in an admissions office, 9 times out of 10, the person would be like, oh, I know that school. That's a good school. Which is great from a practical perspective, but not so great from an equity perspective. The goal should be, I've never heard of this school before. I don't know where it is. It's in a zip code, like I'm totally off my radar, and I still value it and put just as much stock in what I'm seeing as if I did have decades of experience being on a first name basis with the issuer of that. And that, I think, is why we're very excited. At the strategic level, when we were talking about, hey, MTC, how do we scale? How do we have impact? How do we really get what we've built into the hands of all the kids we think that would benefit from it? The thing that really turned the corner on partnering with ETS for that was that ability to provide that third-party, reliable, valid signal in a ways that, frankly, just as a grassroots initiative, we couldn't do ourselves as a collective.
We think of ourselves as peanut butter and chocolate. We're better together because we really do complete like the two sides of the coin, the authentic work, the competency-based, the real school-based work, and then the externally validated tools that can also be used to compare and to set a little bit of common expectation across schools.
And Mike, you used to be a transcript, which was an end of high school signal, but you have private schools using a mastery tracker, a sort of a daily tool to track competencies. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we started with the summative record because we wanted to plant a flag and say, hey, when you get to the end of high school, you should get something that captures your high school experience, your story, not just this sterile output of GPA and credit hours. But as we work with more schools, we'll realize once you start down that road, you start getting these other questions from schools, which is, what if we're not entirely ready to get rid of courses and grades? So we have a version of the record now, it's literally called the MTC Learning Record, that becomes the page 2 of a traditional transcript. All that rich competency and evidence information, but you don't have to completely move away from the what we'll call legacy metrics that may very well still be legally required in your area. Question that follows after that, which is, okay, we've got this, we're generating these records. Where do we keep track of all this stuff? We've got these skills that are really important. We believe young people develop them not in the context of a single semester or a single departmental course, but over 4 years. At the software level, that's just a different object architecture for keeping track of learning progress. And so the progress tracker tool that we built is designed to allow schools to do that 4-year journey of tracking, accompanied with like snapshots of evidence along the way. It's easy enough to do like a grade book. If all you want to do is just count to 4 and do that repeatedly over time, but tagging it with the evidence so you can see how a young person's skills are developing concretely in terms of the work they're doing, that for us was the thing schools really wanted.
And if you have all of those data points, which are evidence of real, authentic learning and good student work and assessments, but we'll just call them data points. If you have all those data points and it's really rich and robust, you can reduce the amount of standardized testing because you won't need that. In fact, the information you have from authentic work and these skills-based assessments are going to be more predictive of outcomes and more helpful in terms of ongoing learning and development. So this is not a stealth effort to get rid of a high stakes end of year test. It's a very public effort to say, let's change the way assessing kids, assessment for what purpose. And if the purpose is to help them grow their skills and give them opportunities, then we've got to rethink how we're doing it.
Mike, I was at your summit a month ago and got to meet a lot of the early members of the MTC. And I just want to celebrate the fact that we're now probably 5 or 6 years into schools graduating cohorts of students with a Mastery Transcript and getting into the best colleges in America. And so we can celebrate victory that Mastery Transcripts work. They help students better signal their capabilities. And as Laura just described, we're now making that system better by adding a lot more information about the skills they've developed and demonstrated and the experiences that led to those skill demonstrations. So the system works and we're making it better. Laura, what happens? Tell us a little bit more about this pilot, and then how do you see this scaling over the next 5 years? When and how will you have 10,000 schools using your assessments and the Mastery Transcript?
Awesome. Okay. I'm so excited because we are piloting in 5 states this spring. I mentioned the states. We are going to be piloting with districts of schools in each of those states, both capturing authentic work and then administering, I think, up to about 20 different tasks on a rolling basis, starting in February through the spring. So again, this isn't a sit and get experience. This is little bits and pieces over a period of time to capture different pieces of information about student learning. We anticipate having 5,000 students take these pilots this spring. For a lot of reasons, we want to both have a small footprint in states so that this is really seen as a trial, a tryout, and not another test. And of course, we need enough students to really provide data to build out these measures, see if they're good, build evidence and validity around them. I really should say that we have a phenomenal technical advisory committee. It'll be on our website, and they're just national leaders from across the country working together to help us make sure we get this right. This is not easy stuff. We are also building out skills progressions. And when I say we, it's a joint task force between Carnegie Foundation and ETS, and then national experts who are reviewing it. All of this will serve as the underpinning of these tasks. We'll start this spring, but then go into the next school year so that we can really have a lot of validity evidence. As I said, we have 5 states now. I was at the NASB meeting last week. And then, as you mentioned, Mike and I were at Aurora, and there is real interest and growing excitement about this. We are hitting the right chord at the right time as the nation makes the transition to a much more tech-based economy from a knowledge economy. So there's a lot of interest, and we had to cap the number to 5 states to be our co-design partners simply because of bandwidth and capacity. But looking ahead to next year, we'll be broadening that group.
Well, it's an exciting solution. I think you'll continue to have more demand than you can handle for a while. Laura, where can people learn more about skills for the future?
We are launching a new website.
We'll include that in the show notes. If you want to learn more about the Mastery Transcript, they can go to mastery.org.
You got it.
This is exciting. I think the framework for the next 30 years, we've just talked about broader goals, better experiences with high quality real-time assessments and better signals in terms of learner records and transcripts. I think that's a picture of the future. Laura Slover and Mike Flanagan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Great to see you.
Thanks to our producer, Mashan Pasha. Until next time, keep learning, keep leading, and keep innovating for equity. See you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.